So Josh, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here. I wasn't sure how to get off mute there.
Did you have trouble getting in?
No, there was just a little bit of delay.
Okay, good.
Um, and just to apologize in advance. I'll be here for, I don't know, another 20 minutes or so, but thanks for hosting.
Oh, you're welcome, and thank you for coming.
Josh,
It is recorded, so you'll be able to access the recording afterwards.
Josh, where are you at?
I'm located in Kirkland, Washington.
And are you with like Parks or?
Uh, no, I've been working on a biomass power project for a while, and we're looking at the option to make biochar.
Oh,
Um,
good.
Yeah,
Very-
so I've looking at all sorts of things in this area, and nationally as well, that would sort of substantiate the market for the volume of biochar that we could potentially make.
Are you connected with IBI by any chance?
No, not formally.
Okay, so we should talk. I have resources that might be useful.
Okay, I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, we've been looking at that for a while, and we're now entering a phase where we may be doing a pilot project to actually make it here. So there'll be a little more focus on that soon, I hope.
Okay, yeah, I'd love to learn more.
Yeah, okay, very good. So there is another person who may be coming. I sent him I sent him a link. I resent everybody the link that you got on with Dan, just to hope that that would work. Did you have to use the password?
The
Dan?
second time I tried it, I did not. No, it kept asking me for one the first time, but the second one, I like defaulted.
Wow, okay. Because I thought I turned it off. That's why I was surprised. And I don't know. I don't know.
And Catherine, when I logged in, it had to be reloaded on my phone. The program,
Oh,
so probably reloading it kind of probably left your site that you sent me to directly with the password embedded, I guess, or whatever. I don't understand this stuff. The more I see
yeah.
this, but
Yeah, I don't know how it's going. So I'm thinking that we should just go ahead with it, and I will send you the recording, which you can use in any way you'd like. And we will record it. It will be on both our network and our YouTube channel. So people will have access. And here comes somebody else. So I want to welcome everybody to Dan Dinelli's talk on biochar and golf courses. I have to let you know that he is a unique person. There's not many people in the world that I have understood that are doing this. So his expertise is indeed rare. So Dan, we're really thrilled to have you here. I want you to know that. I want to give a little shout out for Soil Smart Soil Wise. We're an all volunteer group at this point, and we are actively pursuing the strengthening of the biotic pump here in Spokane and everywhere else that we can possibly do it. And I think the biotic pump is a really key thing for people to get, because it has such a huge impact on so much of what we're struggling with right now. The biotic pump is the mechanism by which nature cools the planet as a natural thing. It brings rain. It cools in a myriad of ways, not just one, but in many. And it's a simple system to understand, in my humble opinion. It is simply healthy soil holds water. That water is evapotranspired by plants into clouds, along with bacteria. And that bacteria allows the water in those clouds to fall at a cooler temperature than it would otherwise do, which means that it is a gentler rain, a more likely to happen rain. And that process happens from the coast across the planet. So it takes water from the ocean, yes, but it manages to transfer that water into inland spaces forever if there are plants to do that, and if there is soil that holds the water for the plants to evapotranspire. So it's not too difficult. And biochar is sort of a jumpstart in my mind, and Dan may have other thoughts, is a jumpstart to allowing that land to hold water, especially if it's sick and hasn't quite gotten its feet under it. It will still hold more water than it would without biochar. So biochar is, in our view, a really nice step into that. So Dan, what got you into this?
Can you hear me okay, Catherine?
Yes, you can. You're coming in great.
All right, wonderful. That's a great introduction. I love it. I think as scientists dig deeper and deeper into the soil system, we're recognizing more and more that it's really the critical part about existence here on this planet. For the things that you mentioned, biochar is a magical material. It's fascinating for me to learn about it. I kind of started a couple decades ago down the compost path and learning about compost and all about different feedstocks and processes to make compost, whether it's vermicompost or more of a pasteurized component of the thermophilic typical composting operations, and the biology that comes with that and the magic. And I'm still a big compost user, but I feel like I went through a similar learning curve with biochar. You know, what's the different feedstocks and what temperatures do you produce the char at, for how long, and how is it cooled? What's the best way to store it? Preconditioning it. So I really enjoy it. I still have a lot more to learn. I'm a golf course superintendent. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a biochar expert, but I tried to understand what I could in about a handful of years' time on how to best utilize it when we rebuilt our greens at North Shore Country Club now over 7 years ago. And um, there's a method that is adopted pretty widely called the USGA recommended root zone, where it's usually 90% a medium type sand that's pretty specific, and usually there's a peat component, 10%, 15% by volume. Sphagnum peat or like a reed sedge peat is usually the organic matter, and that's kind of the traditional, typical recipe, if you will. And Catherine, to answer your question, what got me on the path of biochar initially was the understanding that when we built a research green now 3 decades ago, I think it's been maybe a couple years past that, 32 years ago, um, we did 20 different root zone cells on this putting green. It's a 7,000 square foot putting green. And the root zone cells, it wasn't a replicated, so it was like a case study. It was 14 by 15 feet wide by a foot deep. So if you do the math with that, 15 by 15 by a foot is roughly what a 6 wither would carry in delivering a bulk material. So I reduced the size by a foot on one end to make sure I didn't run short. And we had all these custom blends of root zone mixes done for us to better learn what the differences could be using things like compost, vermicompost, chip humate, biosolids, Dakota reed sedge, sphagnum peat. One cell was just straight sand. You know, this is all using the same sand. And then some inorganic amendments like Axis and Profile, which is a fire clay, Zia Pro, Zia Light, and then a couple polymers in there, you know, those water absorbing polymers, like what's kind of found in diapers, the super polymers in that case. But long story short, we were trying different amendments that is more persistent than peat, perhaps more sustainable or fit the circular economy better than peat, or it's not a material that's harvested perhaps out of a wetland somewhere. And what benefits could we witness in this high sand profile that our industry's married to, in part for good reasons. Sand drains well, it resists compaction fairly well. And those are two big concerns we have in our industry. So, so that's how it kind of got started back in the 60s, I'd say, when these high sand content red zones really got going. And I learned a lot. But one of the general things I learned is that the turf system is going to deposit its organic matter. And it typically does it near the surface in what we call the mat layer. I think a
Yeah.
lot of people have heard about thatch and turf having a thatchy layer. That's typically the organic material that's at the above the soil line. But the organic material that tends to accumulate below the soil line is what we typically call mat. And that mat layer usually ends up being 2 to 3% loss on ignition at 360 percent organic matter. So turf is a pretty effective soil builder, if you will. Um,
Can
and
I ask you a question?
yeah,
Because we have one in the chat and I don't want to get too far away from it. You're using the term root zone. Can you define that?
yeah, great question. So the USGA Red Zone profile is pretty clever. That it's basically you put a drainage network, you core the where the green's going to be, you core it down 16 inches deep, typically. And after you core it down, you put a network of drainage in. About every 20 feet, you have a drain tile roughly. And then you put 4 inches of a fairly fine pea gravel. This is all pretty specific. Um, and and then on top of that 4 inch pea gravel, you put a 12-inch root zone mix. And that's the mixes I was just trying to describe.
Okay. Okay.
And so it ends up having a perched water table. So it's kind of bizarre. Or the greens, for example, if I started out pretty dry right now and I wanted to flush them, I can have the irrigation run for slightly over an hour, or I can get a natural rain event. And once I hit about an inch of water, all of a sudden the drainage, you'll see the water coming out the drain. So
Oh,
basically, it has to hit field capacity and then it flushes. And the gravitational pull combined by the weight of the water itself and that column of sand exceeds the cohesive properties of the water, or the adhesive properties, I should say, and it loses its grip and then falls out of the drain. I mean, it's pretty actually cool to watch. It's kind of, I guess, like try to visualize a raindrop on your windshield. You know, they get to a certain size, they stick on there, and then once they get a certain size, boom, it rolls off that slippery, smooth, pretty smooth surface. So, so that being said, it is designed to be a water conserving root zone profile because of that perched water table. Um, so the water holding capacity wasn't the biggest thing. It was more the organic matter that was. And stop me anytime there's a question, please.
well, I want to know the results
The results of what?
of that experiment.
Oh, well, so that experiment that was unfortunately it did not have biochar in that experiment. But I'm going back to the different rid zone amendments we tried with compost and whatnot. And what I learned from that, which is that mat layer that develops in that sandy profile. So what I was looking at biochar to do was to better match that mat layer throughout the entire rid zone. And what I mean by that, the best way I can describe that is that organic material that the turf basically deposits as it grows through its life cycles, seasonal cycles, is the higher CEC, certainly the water holding capacity, and the biology. So if you can kind of visualize this USGA rid zone where you got a 4 inch pea gravel layer, 12 inches of pretty leaned out sand, uh, and then you've got this mat layer on top of that 12 inches that starts to form when you grow turf on it. And after about 3 to 5 years growth, that mat layer becomes significantly different than the rest of the 12-inch mix. Does that make sense? Can you visualize that?
Okay.
So that introduces another layer that really isn't a layer that you want. You want that ridge zone to be pretty graceful and continuous in somewhat of a homogeneous state, which is not going to happen, but at least you can try to match what you can as a pre-plan amendment with what you know is going to develop on the surface in that mat layer. So in soil science, they call these horizons sometimes the A horizon, that's usually their topsoil and your B horizon. See, so soils end up stratifying like that, certainly naturally, and then over time, it stratifies, especially when you have something like grass growing on it. And that's what got me kind of started with biochar, that biochar would offer that water holding capacity that might better mate with the mat layer, the CEC, so the nutrients should be held better than the cleaner sand would. And my hope was I would have this graceful transition from the mat layer into the ridge zone that the roots will continue to grow deep into. So in other words, why would those roots want to get much deeper than that mat layer once that mat layer gets a certain thickness and holds all,
Right.
the nutrients? Because everything is top loaded in a green like that. The irrigation is applied on the surface and percolates down. The fertilizer is applied on the surface, tries to percolate down. So everything is top loaded and has to get through that mat layer that develops over time, like I said, that's significantly different. So I wanted to gracefully have that transition through that entire root zone. In the industry, what we tend to do, you hear a lot about aerification, chlorophyll, deep tying, drill and fill. We do all of these, these practices that disturb the game of golf. They're expensive to do. Often you got to close the course for a day, 2 or 3, or sometimes a week to get these operations done. And I call it stitching. We're trying to stitch together that mat layer with the root zone below it, and somehow trying to create a vertical mulching effort of creating a void and then backfilling it with sand or some kind of sand medium, and try to connect the two. Some of this would make a lot of sense if anyone's really interested. There's this video done from Washington State back in the 60s, I want to say, where a soil scientist talks about all this. And he talks about how the water basically.
Can you send me the link later?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great, he did a great job. It's very easy to understand once you see it. And it's a very visual thing. That he shows, and you can see how these aerifier holes become dysfunctional pretty quickly. As long as they're daylighted, they work. But once the turf system bridges over that open hole, it's pretty much a dead zone, and the soil around it has to get saturated before it actually works itself way into the sand filled like aerifier hole.
Is this something that's normal with the kind of grass you use on golf courses, with any grass, with specific grasses?
What, the ridge zone being normal?
Well, that kind of a mat layer that you're talking about, is that something that grasses do, or is specific grasses that you're using on golf courses do?
That's a great question, because if you really study, so I'm near Chicago, so I'm pretty, I'm kind of in the Corn Belt area, and we're blessed with these very rich soils, very highly productive soils that, generates a lot of food from corn and soybeans and whatnot. And if you really understand the short and tall grass prairie areas and the grasslands, we used to call them, they're prairies, they're pretty diverse. There's quite a few forbs in there, but a lot of it was grasses. But when you talk about biochar, it's nothing foreign, in the sense that when you had these prairie fires back
Mm-hmm.
many, many, many years, they claim the Native Americans did it. purposely, but prior to that, certainly there was plenty of lightning strikes and whatnot and wildfires that made char. And there's a lot of people that argue our corn belt is largely made up of biochar from those grassland fires, plus the organic material that is deposited from the annual cycling of the plants and the biology that we are getting to know more and more about, the phytobiome and the microbiome that's associated with the rhizosphere that ends up also contributing a lot of valuable inputs, if you will, that creates that upper layer that deepens over time. And of course, with significant rain events, some of these materials leach down into the lower profiles. So you end up with this very graceful and deep zone of extremely biologically rich, microbially active, high organic material that collectively makes what we call our corn belts. Did that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And
So you,
so what I'm hearing, and tell me if I'm right, what I'm hearing is what you're attempting to do is to create sort of a mini version of that in the golf course, because the roots are not long enough to actually produce what they produced in the prairie, but you could do sort of a mini version. Am I right in that?
yeah, I'm trying to mimic some of the things certainly that we learned from the grasslands, and using biochar is one of them certainly, and using compost, like speeding up the process, if you will, the plant. But I guess the biggest challenge I have um, is how do you introduce that without disturbing the putting surface? Because
Yes, yes.
in a natural soil system, um, we we talk a lot about microbiology and stuff because it's so fascinating, extremely powerful. But there's a whole slew of communities that, the bison was a big part of it, for crying out loud, and earth, well, not earthworms, but a lot of the soil shredders. Today, present earthworms is a big part of it. Apparently, at some point, they weren't natives in the United States, from what I understand. So,
Yeah, I've heard that too.
but you have these insects and invertebrates and stuff that end up churning the soil, helping to churn the soil, and they call them soil shredders. Ants is a big part of that in some parts, and so they help the soils commingle. They're our natural aerators in many ways. They also help generate the biomass to become more, I guess, bioactive. So they cycle at a higher rate with the microbes because of the surface area from these materials being shredded, and the natural manures and all that. So it's it's a magical system when you really think about soils, when you have a healthy soil system kind of going at it. But we using sand right away, I had to study like sand dunes ecology as much as grasslands, because what we are trying to grow, these turf areas, probably more closely resembles what a sand dune is like, more than a prairie system.
Yeah.
So then I started to understand biochar more and more, and what infatuated me was the biology. So we started to experiment with different inoculums, how to precondition biochar. And that's where maybe you were referring to, Catherine, some of the test greens that we did. Those were more in a nursery setting that was mowed like a putting green. Um,
Okay.
but it was more like a research plot scenario where that 7,000 square foot green with the 20 ridge zone cells was a real active green being used.
Okay.
So, so we do quite a bit of on-site research. We have people like Dr. Derek Settle help us from the CDGA, Chicago District Office Association, Dr. Cale Bigelow from Purdue, Steve Vaughn, who just retired from the USDA. In fact, we got a couple published papers out there, um, where Steve's done quite a bit of greenhouse work with biochar and turf. And then I try to duplicate some of what he did in the field. So he's got 3 or 4 papers, I think, published on them. Because some of the early work done that I could find was one out of Iowa and one out of Cornell on biochar with turf. And the results weren't overwhelmingly good. They both ironically use switchgrass as a parent material, which isn't my favorite, tends to be pretty ashy. Um, and the pH tends to be pretty high in those chars. And so it's one of those learning curves. It's like compost, how you do it, what are you trying to target, what are you trying to get out of it, will mandate in part how you're going to make it. Um,
So
you know,
did you come to conclusions about that, or are you still experimenting?
I'm always experimenting because you never learn the full story, Catherine. If you're lucky, you get an answer out of a question that you're trying to see, but you usually end up with more questions than answers. And
Yeah, yeah,
but what I'm trying to get at is those two early papers did not paint a really good picture. One, because in my opinion, because it was a short-term study and it used switchgrass, which you could argue perhaps there was a better option. But more importantly, I think, than all of that is the fact that it wasn't preconditioned. And I think we recognize that biochar is a pretty hungry medium and
yeah,
it to be
yes,
satisfied, if you will, before it's gracious to give it back.
yes,
so,
yes.
so,
Yep.
so you have a short-term study and and you got a pretty ashy material to begin with that perhaps has jacked the pH up pretty high in the soil, and you don't precondition it or add any extra fertility this first until it does get preconditioned. You could easily see how that char could possibly suppress plant growth.
Absolutely. Yep. And
And
I think farmers have experienced that.
I think that's what those papers unfortunately illustrated to me.
Ah,
Back and read those, and so it's like everything else, right? You learn the nature of things, and then you learn how to adapt either to them or how to adjust them to your needs. And so we learned from those exercises that if you precondition the char both chemically with nutrients, perhaps even a pH acidifier, and then with the biology, now you're going down some pretty strong paths. And the path I was most interested in was disease suppression. And with the help of Cool Terra, before they Cool Terra, Cool Planet, I think they had a parent name, but they made biochar and sold biochar. Char I got from them was using coconut hulls as a parent material. Very, very high end char. In fact, I think it's a type of char that could have been used in water filters, those canister filters.
okay.
And so they were kind enough. They had a scientist on staff back then that they did some DNA work with a 2-year study that we were on, with using their char with several different. I had a couple different chars actually in the study, but theirs was the main one. And we preconditioned that char several different ways, documented it, and the biology was very interesting. Because back in the 90s, I was really trying to use probiotics to the best of our ability to introduce microbes at higher levels to compete against the diseases, the pathogens, if you will. And
Mhm.
we actually had systems in our pump house that were on-site breweries, if you will. They were basically bioreactors that grew specific microbes, some pseudomonases and bacilluses and some trichodermas, azospirillum, nitrogen fixator one. So we were really trying to use our irrigation system. Since you irrigate turf lightly but frequently back then, you would reapply through the sprinkler system these natural organisms, but artificially elevating them, because in part some of these things are a numbers game. You got to kind of outcompete the bad guys, if you will. I don't like using that term, but the pathogens with the so-called good guys.
Mhm.
And so that being said, it was a struggle to really move the needle. That there was times where we felt confident that we were doing what we were set out to do, and there was other times we failed. So I guess the take home message for me, using inoculums, uh, probiotics, if you want to call them that today, um, bugs in the jug, I've heard them call, you basically, it has to be it has to be consistent, because if it's not consistent, it's not predictable. And that's kind of what I would summarize it, that I think the power is there. It's just how to best use that power so it's consistent and predictable. So I was looking at char to be a delivery tool, that if you can envision this little nugget, this little charcoal like nugget that is all preconditioned, pre-moistened, with a targeted pH and nutrients, and even energy sources like humates or sugars of some kind, polymers if you want, and then inoculate it with either a community of organisms using things like compost tea or vermicompost extract, or specific microbes if you're really targeted towards something. Um, and once you get it established on that little nugget, it's a lot more successful to transplant that nugget already active with that biology than just releasing that biology willy-nilly into a existing soil system. Did that make sense?
Yeah, no, it sounds actually like a really good thing. What did you find that there was a recipe that seemed to work better than others? Was it very location specific?
So again, I think depending on how deep you want to go down the rabbit holes with any of that, first I think first thing I think I'll say is the one of the hard lessons I learned is each disease has its own story. So, for example, there was a lot of work out by your neck of the woods, Washington State. Um, they did work with wheat, and there's a disease called takeoff with wheat. That's the exact same disease complex that bentgrass has, that we call takeoff patch. And it's a root invading pathogen. And Dr. Cook is his name, from Washington State. His team kind of discovered the story on what's behind this, and at a very high level, basically what happens is you have this soil-borne disease fungus that affects the root of the plant, and the uh, the leakage around the wound site, if you will, creates a stimulus towards this fluorescent pseudomonas type bacteria. And then that bacteria is triggered to create this antibiotic to kind of secure its niche around that energy source created by the wound from the disease. And over time, that bacteria populates with the increased disease incidence, and eventually becomes a suppressive soil. And so it's kind of a Cinderella story, if I was able to make much sense out of that, in a biocontrol setting, especially for root, because root diseases are tough. By the time you see symptoms, it's usually too late.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So so that being said, that's what really interested me. So if you want to, depending on what your target outcome is, yeah, you can use char and get the specific organism or organisms is usually a better approach, and use it as a pretty effective delivery tool, either as a pre-plant, because for us that take all disease is really the biggest threat the first several years on a new green, for the reasons I just described. In a weird way, it's kind of like a baby, it's kind of like a young child, if you will, always going out to school, coming home sick, coming home sick, coming home sick. Well, you scratch your head, but really that's setting up that person's life immune system for the rest of its life to become even hardier. So if you try to shortcut that, the outcome may not be what you were hoping to get. So,
Right.
so especially for us with viruses, it works that way, right? And for many of them, not all of them, but so similar thing that in a weird way would take all. You can have a really prone system to take all, but over time it'll actually become suppressive with it. So you can possibly jumpstart that by introducing those organisms artificially, if you will, a higher level, in hopes that the disease incidence wouldn't be enough to merit a pesticide application.
Did you find that was true? Were you able to do that?
Yes,
Yes, but
yes, but again, the trick has always been, how do you ensure that it's consistent and predictable? And so you need scientists to dig deeper into it too, because there's a lot of variables with it, as you know. If you have we had a cool start of the year this year, so soil temperatures, pHs, rain events, dry downs, there's so many things that enter in, plant genetics. So what worked for me might not work for the next person, just because of the cultivar of grass I used.
yeah,
So there's so many things that makes me feel uncomfortable to say, here's our silver bullet.
right, right. Yeah, I'm not one for silver bullets, but sometimes it's fun to start with something and then you play with it from there. If you understand that that's what you're doing, it's not, this is a one and done, but this is a place to start from and then begin to see what actually works in your space. One of the things that I sort of deplore is we hate to really get involved with our land where it is. We want these one and dones. We don't want to think about it. We want to just put it on there and have it finished. And I don't believe biochar is like that. I don't think it was ever used like that. The Indians were incredibly intimate with their particular place. And I'm sure we're adjusting it and playing with it every day, every year, every month, just because that's what you do when you're working with what's in front of you. We don't do that on the West. We want to put it down and forget it. And that's not necessarily the best way to get the best results, but there we are.
Yep, I totally agree. And that one and done, that should be a bumper sticker. No, it's just not. It's just I have a hard time thinking of anything that in my life that I've been able to say, yeah, that was one and
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Is there any thoughts about size? Because that's another thing. And how are you applying this? You spoke briefly about putting it on at the beginning, sort of as what I understood was as more a beginning layer or a foundational layer, and then building on top of it. But so, can you speak to the process and to size and how you get it into the turf?
so yes, I think the best results is as a pre-plant. If you're capable of doing that, you just get a more homogenized, I guess, root zone by working it in decent. You have an opportunity to do it that way. And the size for us has to kind of match the sand particle size.
Okay, I was thinking that might be true.
And but I've also experimented with microchars or liquid forms where it's
Mm-hmm.
raised in, and they worked well too. But I'm a little fearful that they might swim around a little bit. You don't want that. Like I described earlier, we have a defined root zone of 12 inches deep. Then you got pea gravel, and the water backs up from there. So I was a little leery that the material might actually leach down
Right.
pea gravel layer and possibly do something there. And I mean, not it's you can get in the weeds with some of this stuff, pretty heavy, and I don't think I'm ready to say it to the detail that your audience that I can, I guess, be clear to your audience. But when you have fairly clean sand like we tend to use, because 10%, 10 to 15% by volume peat, a lot of that breaks down, like about
Yeah.
half of it down like 2
Yeah.
years. So it ends up being a really pretty clean sand. in many ways throughout that profile. Well, you got little CEC. So you might say, okay, you're gonna lose some nutrients. Well, it's worse than that. It's the wild, wild west of the chemistries because you don't have buffering. So we are seeing things like calcite precipitating out about halfway down that sand ridge zone, or the high bicarbonates in the irrigation water, or the calcareous sand. The water comes in slightly acidic near the surface. Like I said, everything comes from the top down. And then at some point, that water solution, the pH rises too much and the calcium precipitates out, possibly crystallizes, forms things like calcite around some of the sand grains. Now your bulk density changes, your porosity changes. We're seeing weird things like that, that things like biochar could help buffer with the cation exchange capacity it has. Then you also have another weird thing called iron cemented layer right above the pea gravel, where you got iron in these anaerobic zones becoming put in solution. And then as that water solution hits the pea gravel, it basically aerates because of the larger pore space. It has the air to do that and oxidizes that iron and basically deposits an iron layer there that can solidify. Char could help buffer that. So there's a lot of things that we talk about at high levels, but really when you get down to the details, depending on your water quality, your the type of sand you have, because be mindful, sand is nothing more than a description of particle size. We have there's all sands can be made out of quartz and sandstone, many different parent materials, if you will. So so it's, you got to get into the weeds with a lot of this stuff to really start putting the puzzle together in detail, so you end up with the highest degree of success that you can, especially long term.
So that makes me wonder, if somebody else is going to try this, that there needs to be, or it would be a good idea to have a pretty strong group of scientist type folks to do some of these assessments and tests that you're talking about. Am I right? It's not something you just kind of put down and figure out.
Well, it's kind of, yeah, I would say yes. That's always the best approach. But you can probably say a similar thing about compost. There's a lot of
Yep.
there's a lot of rabbit holes you can go down with compost, right? What are the salts and what's the CEC and um, what's the content of organic material? What percent is really carbon? And so again, there's a lot of parallels you can make with biochar, but I think most of us in the field would agree most of the time that if you use a quality compost, you're going to probably get a, a benefit from it.
Yeah.
And so now the next question is, okay, how do you define a quality compost? Well, a lot of different ways. There's a lot of different tests, but where I personally start is how mature is it? And if it's a very mature material, the chances of you getting hurt is probably pretty slim. The next thing I look at are salts, depending on the parent material again. If it's like yard waste or things that contaminants can get into, then you got to start looking into that. But like kitchen scraps that I use to make vermicompost out of from the clubhouse that we get every day, that's a pretty clean energy source. The biggest problem I have with that is the wrappers, the stickies, and the wire ties that come with the broccoli and stuff, as the kitchen people are.
Right.
And, but as far as a chemical reaction or chemical oddity, I feel pretty confident that that's a pretty good food source or food stock for that compost. So I feel pretty confident saying that with char too, if it's a quality char. Again, within limits, you're going to probably get a beneficial, a benefit from it. And I'm going to say the more impoverished the system is, probably the greater level of success you'll witness. So if I took biochar out in a natural prairie soil system that hasn't been contaminated with anything, and I apply char, how much of an impact do you think I'm going to see out of that?
Yeah.
I'm going to guess probably not much. But if you're on a site that needs some sense of remediation, soil building, like my sand that is very, very, very young, if you will, very impoverished. Most of the soils you inherit when you get a house or a neighborhood, they strip all the good topsoil away. And um, if it's a homeowner setting or a park that's getting pounded to death with salty fertilizers or foot traffic, those settings, I think, all can stand, to be as a getting a benefit out of using something like a biochar.
Talk to me for a minute about biochar and fertilizers and herbicides and stuff. Because here I'm not sure that we could, maybe for a small area we could ask them to not use those, but I do know they do use them. And so the longer discussion might be don't, but there might be some resistance to that. So have you had experience with a mix of using biochar and also still using herbicides and pesticides and fertilizers, or do you
Yeah.
usually use less, or you don't use them when you use biochar?
Well, like we talked earlier, biochar, their sites have to be satisfied, if you will. Otherwise, it's going to, be part of the sponge um, because of the amount of surface area that biochar has, and it's going to attract it. So I'm really not an anti, like, I don't even like using the word chemical fertilizer, but the problem with salty fertilizers is just that they have a salt index, and salt is something that you just want to really be careful applying to most soil systems, but it can absorb some of it. And using organic forms of fertilizers with carbon associated, like meals or manure base, I prefer that most of the time, but sometimes manure based fertilizers can be a little too rich and say, especially like phosphorus. So,
Yeah.
so they all have their caveats, and you got to be like the chef in the kitchen putting these ingredients together that makes the most sense for that site and the situation you're in. Um, one might be more prone to leaching than another. The chemical-based fertilizers will tend to move more, but in a golf course setting, we tend to what we call spoon feed. And so part of my irrigation system I described earlier, where we're applying living microbes, I also used fertilizers, but very, very light amounts um, of like nitrates and ammonia based. My best one was ammonium nitrate, which you can't get that anymore. It's really hard to get that. But it's not much different than a good thunder lightning storm, to tell you the truth. And but we can afford to do that at very, very light rates frequently through the irrigation. A lot of situations you don't have that luxury. I guess a center pivot farmer can do it to some degree, but their watering cycle's deep and infrequent, where ours is frequent and shallow because we're growing turf,
Right.
rooted, you know, um, agricultural type plants. So all that being said, I I try to look at them all as tools and try to use the right tool that makes the most sense and environmentally sensitive, and that's cost effective. So I don't know if that answered your question or not, but the herbicide and the pesticide part's very interesting. Um, Again, biochar is being researched and utilized as part of remediation efforts. Whether they're spills or whatever, some toxic waste. And there's some discussion, and again, this needs more study for us to better understand it. But if we do have to use a pesticide, there's a good chance that if you have biochar as part of your amendment, it's going to lock onto those materials. And a lot of those pesticides have a charge associated with it, or they have a carbon element associated with it. So the biology ends up breaking them down. So if you got a really biologically active soil that biochar can help you with a high CEC, there's some strong circumstantial evidence out there that those materials then won't become pollutants in the sense of leaving the site, leaching into a sensitive water, or leaching or running off.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I do know of that capacity for biochar. So yeah, it's just interesting to think about it in these terms, which I hadn't. So I appreciate that.
It's a little bit of a safety net in some ways. Can you
Yeah, yeah,
visualize? So if you have to put the fire out, because let's face it, it's even us, nature, it's pretty rare to have a monoculture in nature.
yeah,
So to have a lawn, to have a farm field, to have a city, I mean, COVID, if you're a thoughtful person, COVID taught us a lot of lessons. And 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 one of them is, if you were out in the middle of the woods somewhere, COVID probably wasn't much of a threat to you. But if you're elbow to elbow with people in a subway system, it can jump from person to person pretty quick. So these concentrated populations of of basically monocultures, whether it's a human, whether it's a grass plant, whether it's bananas, you're vulnerable. You
yeah,
are
yep,
vulnerable.
yeah, yep. Just actually a really good advertisement for diversity.
Yes.
Oh, Dan, this has been wonderful. It really has. I have learned a lot. It will be really interesting to see where we go with this. So I may tap you on the shoulder again and have more discussions when I have more pointed questions. But I've really appreciated your sharing your expertise as clearly as you have, because it is a complicated thing and there are lots of considerations. But I think you've walked through that minefield very nicely. So thank you very much for what you've done.
Well, thank you. It's fun. But Carl, did you have any questions or comments or observations? You were very patient listening to all this.
No, I think I've understood everything. It's interesting to hear how these natural systems, or how you harness natural systems and massage it to achieve a very specific result.
Thank you, Carl. Nature knows best. I think we all know that. We all
Yeah,
recognize it's
yeah.
the teacher out there. So whatever, whatever nature can teach us, I'm all ears.
If we just learn to listen, yep. It's
Yeah.
really all it takes.
Learn to listen to him.
Yeah.
That Dan, that was a little inside joke with Catherine.
That's a joke.
I can be honoring.
So I want to take a minute to talk about Soil Smart, Soil Wise, and encourage people to support us on our work. The biotic pump is everywhere. It's in your backyard. So we can help you make that space really a vibrant and thriving place that will really improve your own personal lifestyle. And we love to help you do that. You can support us in 3 ways. You can donate to us, which would be wonderful. Human beavers that we are, we would really appreciate that kind of support. And we're also asking for donations for our Miyawaki forest projects. We're in conversation with several people, and so we're raising money for the plants that will be required. And if you'd like to see a forest in your neighborhood, that might be a good place to support us. And the other place is we're supporting people in their careers and also building the resource base that we have here in Spokane. So we would like to send 2 people to Elaine Ingram's Soil Food Web School to come back as soil scientists. We now have one of our very own, Faith Mosher, whom you're going to hear from next month. She will be the first webinar up talking about soil science in a slightly different way than you might be used to. Going to talk about all the bugs that Dan referred to, all the little critters that live in the soil. And the other scholarship we would like to have is to Zach Weiss Water Stories program, where he's doing land hydrology at scale. And we are again privileged to have Matt Moser, who has spent some time with Zach Weiss and is in the process of getting his certification there. But we would like more people who are able to help to help people figure out how to make their land hold the water that falls on it. We will have at the end of July, Mitch Rollick, who is also one of our folks, who will be sharing his tool called the Landscope. And he can see in just like 5 minutes. It's almost instantaneous. It's really lovely. He can just look at your land on a digital basis on the internet and show you how both sun and water fall across your land and where your land wants to have water, so that you can then use it in a way that supports what the land wants to have happen, which is an approach that we really support. So those are 3 ways you can support us, and we would absolutely love to have that happen. And you can also join us as a member. We have a network called Soil Smart, Soil Wise, and that network has about 200 people now. So we're really hoping to be able to be more generative than we have there. It should be a fun place to play pretty soon. So you can join that for $10 a month or $100 a year if you'd like. Then you have access to all these wonderful things that we're bringing you. So Dan, thank you again very much. Really appreciate what you've done and what you are doing.
Thank you, Catherine. What you're doing too is wonderful. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Carol. Bye.
Bye-bye.